No, our policy and policy bylaws are pretty strong.
Good.
I think they're just going to review or go through the policies and update.
Good.
Yeah.
That's one thing that often falls down in companies is that good intentions, but we never get around to reviewing them, even though sometimes the business has changed significantly and some of the things don't apply or they need to be modified, but we never get around to it until something bad happens and then we realize it doesn't fit anymore.
Well, you just think of how much has changed in the last 5 years on how people do business and stuff. Social media and stuff.
Yeah.
Those policies are
Yeah. Or that they're created as they need to be.
Yeah, I don't actually do it. I don't care whether it's your test tube or your candy dog. It's a human. Yeah, we just got back from Nashville. A group of you? Just us and another couple, yeah. It was very, very, very fun. Is that the first time? Yeah. Yeah, it's the new Vegas for sure.
There's an easy way to put these just on vibrate, isn't there?
That's how I always do it.
How do I do it? I can't remember.
Go into your sounds.
Yeah, I should be able to just,
I just turned my volume on.
there. I knew it was simple. Need to turn it right off? I'll just turn it off. Yeah. No. I can just throw it in my pocket. It's off now, so shouldn't draw any power. Good to know. I didn't know that. What do you want to do, Terry Lynn? Give it a couple minutes?
You can start.
Okay. It's 8 o'clock even, yeah, getting started on time. No, that's good. Well, good morning, everybody. Yeah. My name is Doug Alloway, and just to give you a little bit of background on me, I've been kind of an HR guy my entire career. Where have I been? Oil and gas, a couple times. Industrial supply, not-for-profit, telecommunications. Obviously, I can't hold a job anywhere. Fortunately, I made it through 40 years and occasionally in some executive positions. So it's been a good ride. And I'm just winding my career down now over the last 18 months, slowly but surely. I'll get used to this retirement thing. People quit asking me to do things. So tell me about you guys. Are you guys all not-for-profit? No? Where are you?
I'm at a oil and gas.
Yeah? Husky? No?
We're manufacturing.
Okay, good. And what's everybody else doing?
I work at the city.
Okay, so that's not-for-profit. Well, it is, but it's sort of, but it's big. It's big. Well, what about you guys? Yeah? Okay, so that's not-for-profit.
And I'm with the B. Fisher Center, which is organization for persons with developmental disabilities.
Good. Yeah. And how big are your organizations? You probably have the biggest one.
500.
Okay. And you're down at?
We're at 220.
Okay. So who's less than 220? So a few very small. That's good. We got a good cross section. Morning.
Nope.
Okay, no, that's good. So we've talked about who I am, who you are, and now we want to talk a little bit about what we want to cover today. So first thing is really kind of the importance of having policies. Why do we need them? Why do we need to have them and write them down and have them somewhere where they're accessible? There's a few reasons why we need policies, and we'll get into that in a minute. We want to talk about the steps in developing the policies and what sort of things do we want to consider as we start thinking about a policy. Obviously, we've got a need, so what things should be going through our mind as we get ready to try and put something together. Once we've got the policy developed, the next piece is the procedure. And the procedure is pretty straightforward. That's the easy part, right? Policy takes all the thinking. The procedure just tells you how to use the policy. And once you've got the policy, that doesn't take a lot of time to implement the procedure. Although in certain ones, there may be a couple of different ways you can go. I'm thinking like expense policies. Does it go to this person in finance or this person, or how will the paper flow go? But generally, procedures are pretty simple. Implementing the policy. And on the surface, that sounds pretty easy, but the whole idea about how do we get the policy to the people that need it? And which people need it, depending on the size of your company. When you're in a big company, you may have policies that only apply to one part of the company, or it only applies to full-time employees. Does it apply to contractors? Does it apply to volunteers? And how do we get the message there? And then an often forgotten one that Terry Lynn and I were just talking about is the review. Once we have our policies in place, we can't just kind of, hopefully not up on a shelf collecting dust, but sometimes they're in a binder and that's what happens. But we need to be periodically looking at them, reviewing them, often adding to them. With all the technology change, just think about the last 10 years and the kinds of policies you've had to develop with all of the software that comes out, all the things people can do at work that's really not helping your business, but they're having a lot of fun using technology to do those things. We have policies for that. And then lastly, what I'd like to cover off is what I think are some of the must-have HR policies. There's a whole myriad of things you can have policies on. Every company's a little bit different, and individually, you know what you do in your business, where you need to develop something. But then there are some that should be pretty standard to keep you out of trouble with the law. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through. Sound good? Anything anybody want to add at this point? Anything anybody want to make sure we talk about at this point? No? Okay. All right, have a read through that. All right, I always loved Dilbert. You got to be kind of a little bit older to get Dilbert. Sometimes if I use Dilbert in a group of just 20-somethings, they kind of look at me like, who's he? He's not a superhero. I don't see him on Netflix. Where did he come from? I think probably most of you can appreciate it, but Dilbert always has something to say on just about everything HR. The good thing about HR policies, I've always found in my career, is that often we don't need to reinvent the wheel. HR people tend to share stuff. Often somebody has something similar. We can take it, adapt it, and call it our own. But if we do have to create a policy, hopefully we don't need to find the white paper on it just so we can get started. We will try and find a simpler process for it. Okay, there's your humor for the morning. Okay, so why don't we start right at the beginning? Definitions. So what's a policy in its simplest form? Anybody? Don't put your hands all up at once. Yeah, it's really a guideline. I like to think of it as a guideline, but it's a principle or a rule or something that we've determined we want people in the company to do a certain way. And then the procedure is really nothing more than how the policy is to be carried out, right? So pretty straightforward stuff. Now, do all policies need a procedure? No. Most need a procedure. Where would be an example of a policy that you might have that you wouldn't need a procedure on? Sorry?
Higher?
Yeah. If we have a dress code, we don't tell you how to put your clothes on in the morning. No, there's a good one. A code of conduct, for example, tells you how to behave in the workplace, what we expect of you, but it just does it in general terms. It doesn't specify how you're to do that. So you don't always need a procedure. So why do we need them? Well, we talked about it kind of outlines how things are done in your organization. Maybe one of the most important things is it keeps you compliant with legislation. And that's something that's relatively new in my career of HR. Early on, people had policies, but we didn't really necessarily quote the legislation. But lately, there's been a lot more legislation that impacts the workplace that we have to have something in our policies on. Consistency is another good reason, right? When we have situations come up within the organization, we want to make sure everybody is kind of pulling in the same direction when that situation happens. Particularly in big companies, that gets to be a real problem. It doesn't get to be a real problem. Potentially could be a real problem on consistency. One manager has a situation and he interprets the right thing to do decision-wise on that is to go this way, to go right. And another manager gets it and he thinks, well, the right thing to do is go left. We want to try and eliminate that and have consistency. Help managers make decisions that are consistent, but uniform and predictable. So policies probably help managers maybe more than anybody when issues arise. And it protects individuals from the pressures of expediency. You ever had a situation where something really big happened in your company and all the eyes of the employees are on management? What are you going to do about that? That was awful. That was bad. Maybe somebody got seriously hurt. OH&S is involved. There's always a bit of pressure to get to the bottom of this right away, to act on this right away. If our policy says something like we will investigate thoroughly all accidents before enacting any decisions, then we can sort of say, hey, our policy says we're going to investigate this thoroughly before we make a decision. We're going to take as long as it takes to do that. And I've seen that happen where there's a lot of pressure on somebody to make a decision. You know, everybody's waiting. Hurry up, hurry up. What are you going to do? What are you going to do? You don't want to do that because that's when you can make mistakes. You've got to have all the facts. And if your policies kind of back that sort of stuff up, then it allows you the time to ensure you make the right decision. All right. So let's talk about steps. The real steps in doing it. The first thing we're going to do is identify a need, right? We're not going to write a policy if we don't have a need to do it. And the need might be, like we talked about, legislation. I think in Alberta, the Labour Minister put in something earlier this spring that said, thou shalt have something in your corporate policies on bullying and violence in the workplace. So that means everybody, you want to have that policy. If you have issues come up in the workplace, you don't have the policy, it doesn't help your case when outside agencies start to poke around and get involved. Consistency, right? That's part of, how did we get here? There's where we want to be. I might have hit something accidentally. So we want to have some consistency in the way we do things. We haven't had that, so we have a need for a policy. There's significant confusion around something in the company. And this confusion causes a variety of interpretations on what we should do. The one that comes to mind for me, and I've been involved in drafting this policy more than once, is around gifting and accepting gifts. And for all of you that are involved in oil and gas, that's a big issue because that's where the money flows, and that's often where these things come into play. So generally, most companies say it's okay for you to go for lunch. Your supplier can buy you lunch. Your supplier might be able to take you golfing. But, oh, your supplier wants to take you to the Super Bowl. Oh, gee, I'd sure like to go to the Super Bowl. Can I do that? Should I do that? Is that ethical? Am I being put in a position where I now owe that supplier something? Those are the sorts of situations that tend to be a little bit sticky, and there's confusion, and it's often a good idea to sit down and have some policy. So I remember one was kind of, that's where the line was drawn. Lunches and golf and stuff was okay. Oilers tickets, if your supplier was going to take you to the hockey game or you and your wife to the hockey game, that was okay. But it wasn't okay for the supplier to give you tickets for you and your wife and not attend themselves. But those are the situations that can come up in a company where there's no right or wrong answer. You just have to make a decision, write it down, and then it avoids confusion for everybody else when that situation comes up again. Or at least it provides a guideline. You can always have unique situations. Maybe the president gets invited to the Super Bowl. He says, screw it, I'm going. Well, I guess that's his prerogative, but he's violating the company policy. Okay, and when we develop these policies, like we talked about, it's a principle. It can be a rule. When we get around harassment, bullying, those sorts of things, that's a hard and fast rule. But for most of our policies, I like to think of them as guidelines. These are the generally acceptable ways we're going to handle our expenses. So maybe we have a per diem in our expenses for when our employees travel. And the per diem is $75 a day. But somebody gets sent to New York and they're in Manhattan for 3 or 4 days in meetings. And $75 a day might get you lunch and breakfast, but just barely. So your employee comes back and says, that's not a fair per diem there. And it may not be. So it's a guideline. It's a generally accepted rule, but you can have exceptions to when it makes sense. All right, developmental considerations, legal. Okay, well, we talked about that. That's more the situation on legislation. So policies on hours of work and overtime and breaks, that's all labor standards. Privacy legislation, how we keep the employees' data, who can access the employees' data. There's a business reason to know, that sort of thing. Safety-related policies to keep us on the right side of occupational health and safety. Making sure there's no discrimination in any of our practices, like recruitment. Anything that's going to attract human rights. We don't like the Human Rights Commission to mess in our business. And if any of you have ever had issue to deal with human rights complaints, you'll know why I'm saying that. And workers' compensation, reporting around reporting accidents or policies around reporting accidents, having some guidelines there to keep us on side with WCB. And if you have a policy in place, it's important that you follow your policy all the time. That can be another thing where if your policies are not sort of broadly out there and brought up and talked about once in a while, they can be forgotten. And somebody can inadvertently not follow a policy, make a decision, and cause the company some grief. And then there's collective agreements. And that's a whole nother thing, because they may have some rules in there that kind of establish the guidelines for a policy for their members. Not that they can supersede anything in legislation, but that it might be slightly different than you would like to do, but it governs those people and it's bargained, and that's just the way it is. Operationally, when we make policies on how we're going to conduct our business, so not the HR side, just generally, we have to always be cognizant about who our policies are impacting. And who's on our group that's kind of formulating the policy. Where I'm going with all of this is sometimes we build a policy or we build a procedure, a way of doing business that we think streamlines what we're doing, and everybody thinks this is a good idea. But we don't necessarily consult people that we didn't know are actually also impacted by the process. And by changing that, you really screw them up. I can think of examples with reports. You get some efficiency experts in, and they're trying to look at your end-to-end process, and they're saying, well, who gets this report that you generate? Well, it goes to Bob. Well, Bob, do you still need this report? No, I get this report every month. I don't know. When I started, I just got it, but I just throw it in the garbage. We don't use it. Well, then we probably don't need it. But maybe Sally and Jim, unbeknownst to you, do get a copy of that report, and they do use it. So when you get rid of that report, you've impacted them as well. So important to kind of look very broadly, especially on operational policies. And the last one is consultation, and kind of just what I said, this whole idea of consulting managers, line staff, if it impacts volunteers, if it impacts consultants, try and have some representation to make sure that this isn't going to cause some other unintended headaches. Okay, now let's look at the policy itself. When we're done this, we'll put you guys to work for a little bit here. So these are all of the sections that you could be tasked with in developing a policy, but not necessarily. What I've put in here is if we looked at government, federal, provincial, municipal, maybe a large multinational, their policies may have all of these sections in it. If you're an 8-person not-for-profit, you maybe don't need to be quite this formal. But I thought it would be good for you to be aware of what all these sections are and why they're there. If you do have to develop policies for your organizations, you're aware of these, you can pick and choose what makes sense for you. Most of them make sense for everybody. Things like references, as we talk about here, it may not apply to you or to that particular policy. Okay, so I'm just going to go over them and just talk about what goes in them. So often at the top of a policy, you'll have the purpose. And it's just the overarching statement about why we're building this policy. So it's the goal. It's the goal of the policy, kind of a summary statement. So a health and safety policy has the purpose of ensuring the safety of all the workers and compliance with relevant legislation. It doesn't need to be any more complicated than that. It's just the purpose of the policy. The scope of the policy is who it applies to. Is this going to apply to everybody in our organization, or is this full-time regular people but not volunteers? Is it employees and volunteers but not consultants? Most of your policies are going to apply to everybody, but maybe not. Just depends. Just to be aware, the scope just defines who this policy applies to. And it's always good to put in who it applies to, so somebody says, yeah, but I'm just a volunteer. Yeah, but the policy says this still applies to you. And then the statement, and the statement's the biggie. The statement is what the damn policy is, the wording of the policy, what it is you want to say, what you want to convey. That's the guts of it, if you will. The responsibility, you should be able to name somebody who owns this policy, or a department that owns this policy. They are the ones responsible ultimately for developing, but they probably developed it in consultation with a lot of people. But they have to maintain it, they have to monitor it, and ensure the implementation goes smoothly. So again, if somebody doesn't own it, if it's not somebody's responsibility, then we get lots of finger pointing, and sometimes it never happens. Definitions. If you have something in your policy where there could be a word that you think not everybody might understand, what would we think for definitions? Disability. Most people know what a disability is, but Does everybody understand the full scope of what can be a disability? Prohibited grounds, just those words. Maybe we want to put a definition in there. So if those words are being used in our policy and we want to make sure everybody is clear on what we mean by that, then we just put the definition down there. Questions. Who do you go to if you have a question on the policy? That's probably the owner, but you need to have somebody, again, own it and be responsible to answer questions on it. References. References probably only come about when you need to refer to a piece of legislation. So if you're doing something on harassment, bullying, hours of work, or something, and you want to refer to the actual, legislation that this pertains to, I don't know that it's super critical, but if somebody disagrees with the policy, then the reference says, well, this is why we have to have this policy say what it is, because it's actually the law. The effective date, well, that's the date it goes into effect. That's pretty straightforward. The review date, we should put a review date on all our policies, and that becomes a personal thing within the company. How often are we going to review them? Most of the organizations I've been with have said 2 years, and in practice, they get reviewed whenever something bad happens, which might be 10 years, even though it says we were going to review all our policies in 2 years. Who reviews the policies? Well, it's the HR department, obviously, usually. And the HR department just sort of sits around and waits for the 2 years to be up so they've got something to do, right? It's a real issue to take the time to get a small committee together to review our policies, see what needs to be changed because our business changes, because legislation changes, see what needs to be added. And not very often, but is there a policy that doesn't apply anymore? Do we not do that? Do we not need that? More often than not, we're adding and modifying. But we should be doing that. That should be part of the policy. And then the last one is kind of the final approval. Who has the power to approve this? Generally, it'll be your ED or your president, but some of them might be board of directors. I remember when I was vice president at EDC, the board wanted a whistleblower policy. So this was around who does an employee go to if they want to report something confidentially, but then the next level is if the president's the problem, who do you go to? And that's why you need a whistleblower policy. So somebody on the board has the responsibility to be the go-to person and how you contact them should that happen. It never happened. Although Ada and I were at the same company once, and Ada knows the president I'm talking to. He got darn close to having the whistle blown on him once for inappropriate behavior. Anyway, you need, some of those things do actually happen, and you need to consider that. Questions on any of that? I don't want to belabor it too much. It's pretty straightforward, but at least these are the sections that you may want to have in there. Good? All right. Anything else I was going to say? No, maybe just to emphasize the wording again. Generally, words like generally, usually, typically, those are the kinds of words you want to use, except in the policies that are like bullying, harassment, where thou shalt not, period, no exceptions, that kind of thing. They're guidelines to give direction to how we interpret a situation and how we want you to behave or handle things. But we don't want to make them so tight that if you deviate even a little bit, for good reason, that you're in non-compliance. We don't want to do that. All right. We're going to put you guys to work. How's best to do this? 2, 4. Should we work in groups of 3 or 4? 2 groups, maybe? Okay. So here's what I thought I would do. or we would do. In your package, in your handout package, all of the stuff that I just went over, this policy template really is the stuff I just talked about. I was hoping in here we would have a blank one of these, but we don't. So why don't you form two groups? Take this kind of information and see how you manage working through each of, how does that keep happening? Whoops. Work through actually building a policy. So my suggestion here was a travel and expense policy. These might be just some things you might consider as an example, but I want to leave it open to you. If you guys have, one of you in your group has a policy that you think your company needs, and you want to use the expertise in your group to just bounce ideas off of, do it. Because it might save you work down the line. But using those guidelines of those different sections, let's take 15 minutes. And if you guys want to be a group, you guys want to be a group. And work through just that policy, an expense policy, a travel policy, a policy of your choice. But do it section by section and see how that works for you and what you can come up with. And then we'll have a couple of examples because we only have a couple of groups. Okay, let's reconvene. You're probably not completely done, but you probably got a lot of it done, and let's hear about it. So group number one, what did you decide to do? Oh, sorry. You need to speak into the cube, and you pass the cube around when you're speaking. Throw.
We decided to do the expense and travel policy.
Okay.
So we just put effective date today, review date 2 years from now. We kind of discuss what our companies normally do, and we figured that would be.
And that can be your official review date. If something comes up, you review it sooner.
Yeah. Approved by the board. Purpose, so to provide guidelines on expenditures and means of travel. The scope would be the board, staff, and any volunteers. Our statement, we just kind of put into bullet form of to include per diems, reimbursement per kilometer, hotel fees, baggage fees, parking fees, entrance fees, requirement of a driver's license, a satisfactory driver's abstract.
For what purpose?
For traveling.
For renting a car.
For using a rented car, or in my case, a municipal vehicle.
Okay, so you would put that specifically in the policy if you were doing it?
Yes.
Okay.
And the requirement to complete a travel request form.
Good.
And we just started on the definitions, so that's where we got to.
Okay, good. Did you find that real easy to do?
No.
No. So a lot of things to consider, particularly on travel and expenses. That's a tough one because there can be an awful lot of variables. And as we discussed, people being people, if there's a way to take advantage of these things that's not expressly stated in the policy, you run some risk. And that's why some of these things are a work in progress. You start with something, you have an issue, you build a policy. That policy, certainly in the early years, ebbs and flows as things come up, but oops, we didn't cover that off. We didn't think about that. Okay, good. How'd you guys do? Spokesperson. Oh.
I'm not a very good ball player. Okay, we did the same one, travel and expense policy. Effective date today, review date 2 years, approved by the board, same thing. Basically, purpose policy is designed to assist approvers and claimants to determine appropriate travel and expenses. Scope would apply to all staff, volunteers, directors, board. The statement, reimburse reasonable expenses on a pre-approved business and travel. And then we would also add in a statement of expenses not to be reimbursed and then identify all of those.
Okay, so you're going to
So-
specifically identify things that are on
Yeah,
on
that
the
wouldn't,
employee's
like,
nickel.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, good.
Just like don't go get an oil change just because you used your car to, you know
Right.
what I mean, that sort of thing. Definition, we would add in there a definition on reasonable to that it would have to be pre-approved if it exceeds a certain dollar limit.
And one of the things we'll talk about in communicating these policies is sometimes there's a little bit of training that has to go along to staff around certain policies. This might be one where what we deem to be reasonable.
Exactly. And so, yeah, we would list, you know, the types of expenses, you know, that would be considered reasonable. You're not
Right.
going to go stay in a $700 a night hotel room
Right.
when a reasonable amount we consider would be $150 cases. Responsibilities would be the board, management, staff, everybody basically follow it. Maintenance of policy would be the HR policy committee, the accounting department in this case.
Good.
Expenses to be submitted within a specified time frame so that you're not getting expenses from 2 years prior. And then questions
With receipts.
with receipts, yeah, with receipts for sure. Questions would be to the supervisor or someone, whoever pre-approved it, and the accounting department who would be looking for the receipts to back up all of those sorts of things.
Good. Good. Anybody find anything interesting in there, or did anything come up that you thought, we'd have to talk more about this one? This one, a little wrinkle. No? Okay, very good. You did well. How about writing a procedure now? Can you write a procedure on how you would do that? Tell you what, let's take 5 minutes just to look quickly at now, write the procedure for it. Again, the procedure is relatively simple once you have the guts of your policy. But if you got the policy down, the procedure is just how we're going to enact it. So how are we going to claim our expenses? Probably the approval through to the claim. Okay. I don't want to spend too much time on it. We've still got some material to cover. And we may do another exercise like this one at the end if we still have some time, so we can work on it then. So procedure, a little bit easier once you have the guts of your policy. You find that? So what did you come up with for your procedure?
We just started by.
Sorry, I forgot.
Again.
My fault.
So the travel request form would need to be completed and sent to the manager for approval. This would include the estimated costs for travel. Then you would submit your expense form with the receipts and where you went, how long. This would go to your manager for approval, and if this is approved, it's submitted to finance. And we also wanted to include in there the procedure on how to complete the expense form.
Right. So we're going to probably have two forms in here. One is to get approval, an itemized list and an estimated cost. And then the second one is actually to be reimbursed for it. Okay? How'd you guys do?
Pretty much the same thing. Pre-approval by the supervisor prior to a form completed. And then once they return, whatever, employee to submit the actual expenses to the supervisor within 15 days. We put an actual time.
No, I think that's good. I think you should put a time limit.
With the expenses are to be supported by the receipts. And then supervisor will review and pass on to finance for final approval, reimbursement. We also put a time frame on that too. Reimbursement would be within 15 days back to of it being sent to accounting.
Yeah, lots of places, no, very good, thank you. Lots of places will run it sort of concurrent with when they run payroll. You know, we're running checks kind of all at the same time, although it's mostly direct deposit, but we're running our financials, so we can do that at the same time. Okay, very good, good. It takes some thinking, doesn't it? And it takes there's a lot of considerations, and like we said, it's a work in progress, so we're always going to update ones like that, maybe more often than some of the others. Certainly when legislation changes, we need to update those. And then some policies are just, if the business doesn't substantially change, some policies may not change for a long time. But it's good to be aware about, have a little bit of practice creating them, and understand the importance of review. Okay, so we're going to move kind of to the next section here now. We've thought about our policies. We've realized there was a need to create a policy. We learned the steps and sections of a policy. We've had a little bit of practice creating the policy and a little bit of practice creating the procedure. Now, what are we going to do with our new policy? And this is probably the most important part. So, first step really is to review the policy with all the key parties. So I understand we've put the policy together. We should have had some representation from all of the key areas in putting it together. That may not always be feasible. People's schedules, who can come to meetings, this sort of thing. So now we want to go back to everybody, to a representative group of everybody that is going to be impacted by the policy, the stakeholders, effectively. The managers, somebody from the employee group, maybe somebody from the volunteer group if it applies to them, all of those things, to ensure that this policy makes sense and that inadvertently we didn't put something in that somebody can't live with, because it impacts something that they do in their part of the business, in what they do. So I want to make sure everybody's there. And it also provides an opportunity for people to read it, to see it, to understand it. We'll get to kind of the sign-offs in a little bit, but more people exposed to it, the more people will ask the questions and get the right answer and have it in their mind. We may want to, in a unionized environment, have the union review it if there's nothing explicit in the collective agreement around that thing. Management has rights. If it's not in the collective agreement, we're doing this kind of as a courtesy. If they come up with something that we think is a good idea, we might want to change it because they thought of something, but we don't have to do what the union says if it's outside the collective agreement. Okay. Next step is approval of the policy. We talked about somebody signing it off. Do we need the board's approval? Is it just senior management approval? Where do we need to go on that? Pretty straightforward. And then we need to actually we skipped a slide here. Did we not? That's where I want it to be. Yeah. We want to get to implementation. No.
I think number 4 is where we were at.
Right.
Go back.
Okay.
We finished number 4
Yep,
yet.
we did. Yeah, okay. So now on implementation, how are we going to implement this? We don't want a policy that sits on a shelf somewhere or sits on somebody's computer or sits somewhere that nobody needs it or nobody knows where to find it. And more importantly, we need everybody to agree to the terms of that policy. We have that policy as a guideline. We need everybody to read it, to understand it, and to agree with it. So our first step is, where will we put them? No, don't want that either. Something happened on the slides. Anyway, do we want a handbook? You guys have handbooks, employee handbooks? And does that handbook have all of your policies in them, or just sort of a summary of key policies? Summary of key policies. Often that's what a handbook is. It really gives basic information to employees around the things that they need to know. It's a little bit of a less formal style, might include summaries of each policy, some key points. It should also include a statement that says the employer has the right at its sole discretion to change, modify, do whatever with the policies as it sees fit. We might have a policies and procedures manual, which would have the full policies, right, in a book. This is probably most critical for managers when situations come up and they need to handle them. But good that the employees, when something comes up, if they've read something in the handbook and they need the full policy, that they know where to go get that. How many people have them on paper copies? Anybody? Yeah? Okay. What's the problem with a paper copy? If it's a small group, and there's enough copies and people all know where they are, great. Everybody gets one. Okay. When a policy changes, though, when we have paper copies, we have to go around and give individual ones out and remove old ones. It also requires, well, we'll get into the statement of understanding in a minute, but it's best, but not always feasible, if we can have them online somewhere, on an intranet or on a shared drive, because then as we change or modify something, we can alert employees via email that there's been a change, and make sure that they read it and send back some form of acknowledgement that they've read it and agree to it. And I've done that as simply as just having them return the email. You know, at the bottom of the change, by sending a return email, it's implied that you have read, agree, and will abide by this new policy. Just something on file to show that they've read it. Because you can see, obviously, if we get into issues on that policy down the road that potentially goes to litigation, it's important that you can show that the employee knew the policy or ought to have known the policy by virtue of kind of signing off on the policy, basically. You browbeat them. Yeah, and it does happen. In big organizations, it's really hard. Somebody has to kind of manually make sure that everybody returns it. I've done that sort of with well, we'll get into that in a minute too, but the idea that all policies should be reviewed and signed off annually, ideally, but biannually for sure, because there is precedent in court cases whereby if an employee signs off on something and violates it and is dismissed because of it, but it's 10 years old and they've never been encouraged to reread that and sign off on it again, there's a bit of an argument that they'd forgotten.
It's also too with it as well that if you've made every attempt to send out the information, you've presented it to them, you've got email trails, you can show them it's been sent, they just haven't responded to it or haven't dealt with it, you can also use that as a precedent to say, we have gone out and done this. The fact that they didn't want to respond is another issue.
Yeah, and some people will use that as a strategy to kind of think in their own mind that I can do whatever I want because I didn't sign off on that. No, it doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way.
I had a situation where I had to dismiss someone for something, and actually EI connected with us, and they needed that sign.
Yeah.
That sign that he acknowledged that he had read the policies and we just do that in
Yeah. Particularly the legislated ones, the ones on bullying and harassment and workplace behaviors. If they've signed off that they won't do that and that they agree those are bad things and then they go and do it, you're on pretty solid grounds to take whatever action you deem appropriate. So again, you can send updates via email. Probably if you can have it, if the policy located somewhere else, and just advise the employee an update has been made to this policy, please read it and respond back, and your response will be considered the same as you signing off on it, that you've read it and you agree to abide by it. Absolutely.
What if it's talked about in a toolbox or a safety meeting, and they sign off at the end of the safety meeting, that's they attended, would that count as a sign off?
Yep, I'm familiar with those too. Very important to get all of your staff signed off on all of those toolbox talks, signed off on your FLHAs, signed off on your daily safety permits. Yeah, that's why we do it, is to cover our, you know what. All right. And I want to talk just for a minute about policy information sessions. A lot of this stuff can get covered off in a proper orientation, but you can also have sessions, particularly if you're changing a lot of policies or there's been a complete review, some have disappeared, there's new ones, there's modifications, and you don't have too big a staff, or you can do it in groups where a manager, you kind of train the trainer, and then you have the manager at their next staff meeting go through all of the changes. So, and then we have everybody sign off that they were present and that they got that information and they understood that. And another way to get the sign off. But a good way to actually do it face to face where people can ask questions. And it's under the assumption that the trainer actually understands it well enough to answer the questions all correctly. And then we get to the statement of understanding. So this is the sign off, if you will. Really important that in one way or another, each employee acknowledges that they've read, understand, and agree to abide by the policy or the complete policy manual. People are new employees, not a problem, right? They're eager to please. They, I'll read through all of that. Yeah, I'll sign off on it. Well, don't know that they really read it all that thoroughly, but as long as they signed off on it, you've done your due diligence and they own it if they don't abide by it. And I had situations where people say, well, how was I to know? It's in your policy manual. I never saw it. Yeah, you did. You signed off on it. You have an obligation to read what you sign off on. How many of us now, when we go to download an app or something on our phone, do you agree to the terms and everything? Yeah, we tick the box. We don't read it. We should really be reading that before we tick the box. Okay. Policy maintenance. So we've talked a little bit about this. Really important that we do have a time frame that we agree to as a company where we're going to go back and review all of our policies, okay? Probably 2 to 3 years is practical. Ideally every year, but it's not practical because often it's HR's job. We have to take it on. We have to set aside a lot of time. We've had new policies come in. We need to get the right players to review certain policies. So it's a very time-consuming process, but a good one to do to keep us out of trouble. Any of the policies that are affected by legislation, obviously they change at time of legislated change, as long as you're aware of that. And I think more and more we're going to see changes with regard to behavior in the workplace. That seems to be the big one now. We don't like the Donald Trump style of leadership in the workplace. Actually, I've got some other examples of that in the discipline one that we'll talk about later on. Questions? Anybody have any questions so far? All right, let's go to kind of the last slide in this. And I know this is really hard to read, particularly from the back, but what I wanted to do was list some common HR policies and highlight the ones that I thought you absolutely need in your manuals. So maybe what I'll do is just read through them and we'll talk about the highlighted one. So accessibility in the workplace could be a policy. Code of conduct is a very important policy. You want to have something that outlines how your employees are expected to behave. Confidentiality could be a separate one, but it also could be included in your code of conduct. What's the name escapes me. Conflict of interest, that you don't do a part-time job that's conflict of interest in any way, or put yourself in a situation that could be construed as a conflict of interest. All of those things should be in your code of conduct. Confidentiality, you could do one separately or include it. Conflict resolution, how you will deal with personal conflicts, maybe. Copyright, not so much. Dress code, how many have dress codes? And that probably came about because there was a need for a dress code, right? Or was it always there? Good, good.
How to identify, I don't know what not to.
Yes. What I've noticed over the years, over my many years in HR, was things have progressively gotten sloppier and sloppier and more. Sometimes it's kind of like, that's okay to change the oil or work in the garden, but it's not okay to come to work like that.
Well, I think it's a generational thing.
Right.
What's accepted or what's considered.
Right, right. Maybe we won't read all of these. I'll just highlight the ones that I think on here are important. A hiring or recruiting policy. This idea that we are a non-discriminating, what's the word I'm looking for? Open employer, that we hire on the basis of merit and how we go about our recruiting process, something like that. Equal opportunity employer, that's the word I was looking for. We probably want something in there on leaves. Now that can be vacation, that can be leaves of absence, how we will handle bereavement. Because bereavement's one that if you don't have something in place, becomes very contentious and it's kind of an emotional thing. And you don't want to look punitive to somebody, and there can be exceptions. I mean, not too uncommon, leave for immediate family can be a week. But what happens if immediate family lives halfway around the world and you have to go to a funeral there? Now we have to use some discretion. So why these policies give us a general guidepost, but we can have exceptions to them. And everybody's different. You know, my mother passed away last month and she'd been sick for a long time. Her best before date was many years ago. She had dementia, and this has been coming for years and years. Well, and all of the immediate family is in the city. That's, you know, people get old. That kind of, you're anticipating that, but that's sure an awful lot different than a parent that's young that got hit by a car and unexpectedly died. And then how people react to that. So there's so many variables in there. We want to be compassionate, but we want to have some guidelines to help us figure out what we should do, and also for the person impacted to say, well, this is the company's policy. So I might ask for a little bit of extra consideration, but I know sort of what the guideline is that my manager works within. Yeah, that's one thing in HR. We deal with a lot of stuff that's nobody else really wants to deal with. And ideally, the hiring manager should deal with, but guess where it lands? We know where it lands. Vacation, you should have a vacation policy, and that's kind of a lot of the basics are set out by labor standards. employee records, how we're going to handle employee records, keeping everything secure and people having access to it on a business needs to know only. We talked about harassment and bullying. Outside employment, conflict of interest, depending on what you're doing. If you have a lot of part-time or people that work something less than full-time hours, have a second job. Most times they have a second job doing something else, but to make sure it's not in a direct conflict or compromising way to your business. Internet and email use, there's a big one. You really should have a policy on using your company technology. And that can be anywhere from thou shalt not use company property to go surf the internet for anything other than business reasons, right down to we trust you, we know you'll use your best judgment, you're here to get your job done, but we also understand that life goes on, your personal life goes on while you're at work. And if taking a couple minutes to research something or to get the doctor's phone number or something take some stress off you so you can focus back on your work, that's okay too. So it can run a fairly wide scope there. But having some kind of a policy there helps you manage situations where people seem to have gone astray from your policy. Health and safety, you want to have some rules in there around following your workplace practices. And performance management. How we are going to work with you so you have clear expectations, that you get coaching and feedback, that we help you do your job as best we can. Workplace diversity, you may want a policy on that. Just again, stating that you're an equal opportunity employer, you value diversity, you want to embrace that. And I think a whistleblower policy is always a good one too. Having been down that road, knowing that there's a safe place for people to report things that they see that aren't right, be that theft, be that behavior towards others, things that you just know the company wouldn't stand for, but you don't want to rat somebody out and have that come back to hurt you. So where is that safe place that you can report that stuff? All right, we have, I don't know, maybe no minutes to 10 minutes. I thought we could do another exercise, but maybe we won't do that right now, just in the interests of time. Why don't we not do our third exercise? I have included in your package a couple of samples. One was from the HR Council on a confidentiality policy, just as a sample. Is there anything else in there that I've given you just as a sample? Oh, the statement of understanding. So the sign-off sheet, basically to give you some wording if you need to create something in your workplace around, I agree to abide by the policies that you've presented and that I've read. Just some language around that, not to take that one and just use it. Obviously, there's a fair bit of stuff on the intranet. When you need to create this, you can talk to other like organizations, and HR people are really good at sharing this sort of stuff. You shouldn't have to reinvent the wheel. Shouldn't have to go look for the white paper on how to create policies and procedures like Dilbert did. Questions? Thoughts? Situations? Anybody have a particular situation they would like the benefit of the group's thoughts on? Happy? Yeah, www.hrcouncil.ca has lots of this stuff on there if you need some help in doing something. We were going to do one on a confidentiality policy, but I think it'll carry us well beyond our time.
You got some time.
I don't know if the question
Yeah.
is now or not, but how do you break a bad, a new employee brings a trait from another employment that you don't really do at your place of business?
And they want to carry on behaving or doing something the way they did it before.
Yeah, our practices are different.
And you've explained your practices, and you've acknowledged that we don't do it that way. And they're within their 3-month probationary period.
No, because he's taken on a different position or wanting to take on a different position.
So he's a permanent employee without the benefit of probation. Well, if we've clearly stated what our position is and that we no longer want him to behave like that, and if we've given him the opportunity to improve, and he hasn't, then you want to stick around for the disciplinary presentation coming right up in a couple of hours here. And we'll talk about how to deal with that. Do we want to try one more? Chris, it'll take us past 9:30. Okay. All right. Let's try one more. Let's try confidentiality. Why don't we go back into your groups and see how you do on, if you don't want to fill in all of the stuff like the effective date and all of that, you don't need to, but have a go in your groups about writing a policy around what you think your employees should do on confidentiality. Here's some ideas to help get you started. I've yet to be somewhere where this hasn't come up, where somebody has inadvertently, not necessarily with intent of malice, talked to somebody about stuff that they shouldn't have. So this is an important topic. What were some of the harder things about writing a confidentiality policy that you found?
In our cases, I would say that it's tough to define it in the sense of ensuring that everybody will follow it right through their employment and past their employment.
Yeah, very hard to control past,
Yeah.
but in some cases you don't want them to go to a competitor. So if you're controlling them past, they might have an employment contract that doesn't let them go to a competitor. And that's a whole nother kettle of fish about starting to limit the person's ability to earn a living. Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, and we were specifically referring to like the banking industry, the information that maybe even a teller will see, and they leave an employer, and it's about what they may know about a member's account or a client's account. If anything is shared externally, right, even after you're done that employment, it can become a problem. Right?
Yep.
So I know what we do in our organization with reference to our persons with disability client files. At the time, and I'm sure all employers do this, we have each employee sign that confidentiality statement, right? Because then it covers that.
Yep.
That piece.
Yep. No, I think that's a very wise move. If you have a standalone, if it's not encompassed in your code of conduct,
yeah,
to have them do that. But it's a little bit difficult, I think, and you alluded to that, to determine just what kind of information do we want to protect that employee sharing outside. And you can't, it's very difficult to itemize everything and get it all that couldn't be something that shouldn't be shared anywhere else.
Well, again, it's in the eyes of the beholder. Like, well, I didn't think that was, you know what I mean?
Exactly. Yeah. And when some of these issues become a big deal, was their intent to use that information for personal gain, or was it a casual conversation and an accident, not realizing how that information could be used by somebody else because you didn't sort of think the next step because you had no reason to? Yeah. Good.
Do you want me to carry on? Or?
Carry on.
Okay.
Sure.
Our purpose was confidentiality policy defines and describes the management of confidential information for all employees, clients of said company. The scope, it applies to all employees, volunteers, board, and clients, I guess. Statement: information is confidential and every safeguard should be taken to ensure information is kept confidential. Responsibility is all the employees, volunteer, board shall keep confidential and not share during the continuance of their employment or any time after, or disclose anything out to other persons. And that's as far as we got.
You've written something like this before.
Well, I mean, we have
Or your
one.
group
It's very,
has-
very, very
Yeah.
structured. So we just
One thing you could do inside a policy too is put examples of the kinds of information at a high level that is considered proprietary and should not be shared.
great.
Good.
You want to share yours?
Chuck it. You can throw it.
I would say ours is very similar in that our wording is just a little bit different, but we pretty much caught everything. Just some of the definitions that we would include would be what confidentiality means, consequences such as what disciplinary action is, what breach of confidentiality means, and then just referring to things like the Privacy Act and that.
Good.
Yeah, pretty much the same.
Good. And again, depending on your business, you could even put in examples of things. The good thing about putting in some examples, there's obviously things that are pretty obvious that would be proprietary, but there can be other things that people would inadvertently talk about. And I'm as guilty as anybody, talking about something that somebody says, well, geez, that's kind of a proprietary idea. I don't know if we want to share that idea with somebody else. Well, maybe I shouldn't have said that, but I didn't. It was just conversation, right? It just kind of the importance. So sometimes if we state what we consider that to be, sometimes lights will go on and say, oh, I never thought about that being something I shouldn't share, but I guess when I think about it, I shouldn't. So, no, good work. In any case, writing these policies, a lot of the sections are easy. The guts of it takes some real thinking, and they take some looking at and re-looking at and coming back and changing as we need to, and then revisiting them from time to time to make sure that everything still works. And hopefully you never get into court or have OH&S give you a big fine or labor standards come down hard on you. The one thing about all those organizations, if they have reason to come into your organization for a specific purpose, they tend to come into your organization more regularly just to check up on things and see how you're doing. Things you really don't need to have happen as you're trying to get your business done. Okay, good. Well, why don't we call that a wrap unless there's any other questions, and thanks for listening.